July 3, 1863, 3:00 p.m. The air above Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, shimmers with heat and humidity. 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Wool uniforms stick to skin. Dust hangs motionless in the thick summer air. Along Seminary Ridge, 12,000 Confederate soldiers stand in perfect formation, their butternut and gray uniforms forming neat rows that stretch nearly a mile. Before them lies an open valley, 3/4 of a mile of farmland with nowhere to hide, no trees, no walls, just grass, wheat, and death. Beyond that killing field, Union forces wait behind stone walls on Cemetery Ridge, their artillery barrels pointed directly at the Confederates like the fingers of doom. In less than 1 hour, half of these Confederate soldiers will be dead, wounded, or captured. The bloodiest 50 minutes of the entire Civil War is about to begin. This is Pickett's charge, the moment that would become legend, the instant when the Confederacy reached its highest point and began its fall. But how did it come to this? Why would thousands of men willingly march across open ground towards certain death? The answer lies in 2 days of brutal, indecisive fighting that left both armies battered, desperate, and searching for a knockout blow that could end the war. Robert E. Lee, the legendary commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, had invaded the North for the second time. His objective was simple, yet audacious. Strike deep into Pennsylvania, threaten major northern cities, and force the Union to negotiate peace. For 2 years, Lee had done the impossible, defeating larger Union armies again and again through brilliant maneuvers and aggressive attacks. He had become invincible in the minds of his soldiers. They believed that if Lee ordered it, they could do it. That faith would be tested today. On July 1st and 2nd, Lee's army had hammered the Union forces commanded by General George Meade. They had pushed the Yankees back through the town of Gettysburg. They had nearly broken the Union left flank at Little Round Top. They had assaulted Culp's Hill on the right. But nearly and almost don't win wars. Despite horrific casualties on both sides, already over 35,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in just 2 days, neither army had gained a decisive advantage. The Union line, shaped like a fishhook along the ridges south of Gettysburg, had bent but not broken. Now on the morning of the 3rd day, Lee faced a choice. He could retreat back to Virginia, admitting defeat. He could continue attacking the Union flanks, which had proven costly and inconclusive, or he could do what no one expected, attack the center. Lee chose to attack the center. His logic seemed sound. The Union forces had reinforced their flanks after 2 days of fighting. That meant the center must be weakened. One massive assault, concentrated at a single point, could shatter the Union line. Once broken, Confederate forces could pour through the gap, roll up the Union flanks from behind, and turn a tactical victory into the decisive win that would end the war. It was a Napoleonic strategy: hit the enemy where they least expect it with overwhelming force. But there was one problem, one man who saw disaster coming and tried desperately to stop it. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted corps commander, the man soldiers called Lee's old war horse, opposed the plan with every fiber of his being. He had studied the ground. He had observed the Union positions. He knew what Confederate soldiers would face crossing that open field. When Lee told him to organize the assault, Longstreet protested, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know, as well as anyone, what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Lee's response was firm. The attack would proceed. Longstreet would command it, and the divisions of Major General George Pickett, Brigadier General James Johnston Pettigrew, and Major General Isaac Trimble would lead it. Longstreet returned to his position, knowing he was about to order thousands of men to their deaths. Years later, he would call this day the saddest of his life. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to rise on one of the most famous and most doomed charges in military history. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. At 1 p.m., 150 Confederate cannons, the largest artillery concentration in the Western Hemisphere, would unleash a 2-hour bombardment designed to pulverize the Union center. The shells would destroy their artillery, shatter their infantry formations, and create chaos in their ranks. Then, while the Yankees were still reeling, 12,000 Confederate infantrymen would march across the valley in parade formation and sweep the demoralized defenders from Cemetery Ridge. It would be glorious, it would be decisive, it would end the war. At least that was the plan. George Pickett's division would spearhead the assault. His 5,400 Virginians were fresh. They had arrived too late to fight on July the 1st and 2nd. While other Confederate units had been ground down in 2 days of savage combat, Pickett's men were rested, organized, and ready. 3 brigade commanders led them: Brigadier General James Kemper, Brigadier General Richard Garnett, and Brigadier General Lewis Armistead. All 3 were experienced officers. All 3 would become casualties before the day ended. Armistead was perhaps the most fascinating of the 3. A 46-year-old widower who had lost 2 wives and several children, he was a career soldier decorated for bravery in the Mexican War. He was also a man haunted by a friendship that the Civil War had shattered. Before the war, while stationed in California, Armistead had been close friends with a fellow officer named Winfield Scott Hancock. They had spent evenings together, sharing meals and conversation. When Virginia seceded and Armistead resigned his U.S. Army commission to join the Confederacy, he had hosted a farewell party. At that party, with tears streaming down his face, Armistead had given Hancock his dress uniform and told him, "You may need this." Then he had placed his hands on Hancock's shoulders and said, "Goodbye. You can never know what this has cost me." Today, Armistead would lead his brigade towards Cemetery Ridge. Defending that ridge would be Hancock's Union Second Corps. The 2 friends would meet again, but not as they had hoped. At exactly 1:07 p.m., the Confederate bombardment began. The sound was unlike anything most soldiers had ever heard. One Union officer described it as the most terrific cannonade of the war. The earth shook. The air turned white with smoke. Shells screamed overhead, some passing over the Union lines to explode harmlessly in the rear, others slamming into Cemetery Ridge with devastating effect. One shell nearly killed General Meade himself, killing an orderly standing next to him at his headquarters. For 2 hours, the cannons roared. Confederate artillerymen worked their guns in the blistering heat, sweat pouring down their faces, hands blistered from handling hot barrels. They fired round after round, believing they were destroying the Union artillery, preparing the way for their infantry. But they were wrong. Most of the Confederate shells flew too high, passing over the Union soldiers and exploding in empty fields behind them. The Union artillery, far from being destroyed, was being carefully preserved by Union Artillery Chief General Henry Hunt, who ordered his batteries to cease fire to save ammunition and make the Confederates think they had been knocked out. It was a deception that would cost thousands of Confederate lives. Around 3 p.m., the bombardment ceased. Smoke hung thick over the battlefield. Confederate commanders believed the Union artillery had been silenced. Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, the Confederate artillery commander, sent a message to Pickett. "For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns are gone. Come quick, or my ammunition won't let me support you properly." Pickett took the message to Longstreet. "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet couldn't speak. He simply nodded. Pickett saluted, returned to his division, and gave the order that would echo through history. "Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from Old Virginia." From the woods along Seminary Ridge, the Confederate infantry emerged. 12,000 men in perfect formation, regimental flags unfurled in the breeze. Officers on horseback rode along the lines. The formations were so precise, so beautiful, that Union soldiers watching from Cemetery Ridge stood transfixed. One Federal officer later wrote, "None on that crest now need be told that the enemy is advancing. Every eye could see his legions, an overwhelming resistless tide of an ocean of armed men sweeping upon us. Right on they move as with one soul in perfect order, without impediment of ditch or wall or stream, over ridge and slope, through orchard and meadow and cornfield, magnificent, grim, irresistible." For a moment it seemed like a parade ground exercise. The Confederates marched with precision, maintaining their alignment, their officers calling cadence. The distance to Cemetery Ridge was approximately 1,400 yards. At normal marching speed, it would take about 15 minutes to cross. But this was no normal march. This was a journey into hell. The killing was about to begin. When the Confederate infantry reached approximately 700 yards from Cemetery Ridge, General Henry Hunt gave the order. The Union artillery, which the Confederates believed had been destroyed, roared back to life. Over 100 cannon opened fire simultaneously. Solid shot, 12-pound iron balls, ripped through the Confederate formations like a scythe through wheat. Where a cannonball struck, it didn't just kill one man. It tore through entire files of soldiers, dismembering bodies, sending limbs flying, leaving trails of dead and dying men in its wake. One Union artilleryman reported seeing a single shell kill or wound 10 men. The Confederate formations staggered but kept moving forward. Officers shouted orders to close ranks. When a man fell, the soldier behind him stepped over the body and filled the gap. The line had to stay intact. That was the doctrine. That was discipline. That was how you won battles. But no military doctrine had prepared them for this. At 500 yards, the Union artillery switched from solid shot to case shot, shells that exploded in the air, raining shrapnel down on the attackers. The sky above the Confederates turned into a steel storm. Men began dropping by the dozens. A Georgian soldier later recalled, "The air seemed to be filled with bursting shells, shot and canister. Death in every form seemed to be riding on every breeze." Still, they marched forward. At 300 yards, the artillery switched again, this time to canister. Tin cans filled with iron balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns. At this range, canister could destroy entire ranks in a single blast. The Confederate formations, once so beautiful and precise, began to waver and fragment. Gaps appeared in the lines that could no longer be filled. The ground was carpeted with bodies. Blood soaked into the Pennsylvania soil. The screams of wounded men mixed with the roar of artillery. And then the Union infantry opened fire. 6,000 Union soldiers stood behind stone walls and earthworks on Cemetery Ridge, their rifles loaded and ready. When the Confederates came within 200 yards, they unleashed a storm of lead. Minié balls, conical bullets that tumbled and tore through human flesh, cut down the attackers in waves. A Union officer from the 8th Ohio Infantry described the scene. They were at once enveloped in a dense cloud of smoke and dust. Arms, heads, blankets, guns, and knapsacks were thrown and tossed into the clear air. A moan went up from the field, distinctly to be heard amid the storm of battle. The Confederate advance should have broken. Any rational military force would have retreated under such devastating fire. But these were Lee's veterans. They had followed him to impossible victories before. They believed in him absolutely. So they kept coming. Brigadier General Richard Garnett, suffering from a leg injury, rode his horse directly into the maelstrom. He knew that riding a horse made him a target, a conspicuous target, but he couldn't walk, and he wouldn't stay behind. Somewhere in that smoke and fire, a bullet found him. Garnett fell from his horse dead. His body was never recovered. The Confederates reached a sunken road called the Emmitsburg Road, about halfway across the valley. Here many soldiers stopped, taking shelter in the depression. Some would never leave it. Later, after the battle, Union soldiers would find Confederate soldiers hiding in that road, too terrified to advance, too terrified to retreat, simply waiting for the nightmare to end. But others pressed on. On the left flank of the Confederate advance, the formations were disintegrating. Entire brigades were being shot to pieces. Pettigrew's division, already battered from fighting on July the 1st, was taking horrific casualties. Union forces enfiladed them, firing into their flanks, creating a crossfire that no troops could withstand. Men fell like dominoes. The left side of the charge collapsed, soldiers streaming back toward Seminary Ridge or surrendering where they stood. But on the right, Pickett's Virginians kept coming. They had taken terrible losses, hundreds of men already down, but they were closer now, just 100 yards from Cemetery Ridge, just 100 yards from the stone wall, just 100 yards from glory or death. Leading them was Lewis Armistead. He took off his black hat, placed it on the tip of his sword, and raised it high above his head so his men could see him through the smoke. Then he shouted words that would echo through history. "Come on, boys, give them the cold steel. Who will follow me?" 250 men followed him. Out of thousands who had started the charge, 250 reached the stone wall. They were about to write the final chapter of the bloodiest 50 minutes in American history. But crossing that wall would not bring victory, it would bring tragedy. Armistead and his 250 men crashed into the stone wall at a bend called the Angle. For a brief, impossible moment, they broke through. Confederate soldiers surged over the wall, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat with Union defenders. They captured 2 abandoned Union cannons, though they had no ammunition to fire them. This spot, this tiny breach in the Union line, would later be called the high watermark of the Confederacy. The farthest point Southern forces would ever reach. The moment before everything began to fall apart. Defending the Angle was Brigadier General Alexander Webb's brigade. Webb's men fought desperately, firing at point-blank range, wielding rifles as clubs when there was no time to reload, and commanding the entire Union Second Corps, orchestrating the defense even as blood poured from a severe wound in his thigh, was Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, Armistead's old friend, the man he had said goodbye to with tears in his eyes 3 years earlier. Armistead never knew Hancock was there. In the smoke and chaos and screaming, he couldn't have recognized anyone. He was focused on one thing, pushing forward, holding the breach, allowing reinforcements to pour through. He placed his hand on one of the captured cannons, a symbolic gesture of possession, and shouted for his men to turn the guns around and fire into the Union ranks. Then the volley came. Multiple rifles fired simultaneously. Armistead was hit 3 times, in the arm, below the knee, and through the torso. He collapsed near the cannon, mortally wounded. Union Captain Henry Bingham, who like Armistead was a Mason, rushed to his aid. Armistead, knowing he was dying, removed his personal effects, his watch, his pocket items, and asked Bingham to give them to Hancock. "Tell General Hancock for me," he whispered, "that I have done him and done you all a grave injustice, which I shall never cease to regret." The breach lasted only minutes. Union reinforcements poured in from all sides. The 250 Confederates who had crossed the wall were surrounded. Some surrendered. Others died fighting. Still others tried to retreat back across that terrible valley. Within 15 minutes of reaching the wall, the attack had completely collapsed. Back across the open field, the surviving Confederates stumbled through the smoke and carnage. Some helped wounded comrades. Others ran in blind panic. Most simply walked in shock, unable to process what they had just survived. Union soldiers, respecting the courage they had witnessed, held their fire during the retreat. A few Union officers on horseback picked up fallen Confederate battle flags and dragged them through the dirt, but most soldiers simply watched in awed silence as the shattered remnants of that magnificent formation limped back to Seminary Ridge. Robert E. Lee rode out to meet them. As shell-shocked soldiers staggered past, Lee repeated the same words over and over. "It's all my fault. It's all my fault. All this has been my fault." When he found Pickett and ordered him to rally his division for a possible Union counterattack, Pickett replied, his voice breaking, "General Lee, I have no division." The numbers told a story of unprecedented carnage. In less than 1 hour, 50 minutes of actual combat, the Confederates suffered 6,555 casualties. That's 60% of the attacking force, 60% killed, wounded, or captured in under an hour. Of Pickett's division alone, 2,755 men became casualties, nearly half his force. Every single one of his regimental commanders was killed, wounded, or captured. All 3 of his brigade commanders fell. Garnett killed, Kemper severely wounded and captured, Armistead mortally wounded. In Pettigrew's division, the 26th North Carolina Regiment, which had already lost half its men on July 1st, added another 687 casualties, the highest regimental loss on either side during the entire battle. The Union suffered approximately 1,500 casualties defending Cemetery Ridge. A significant number, but nothing compared to the devastation inflicted on the attackers. General Meade, despite his victory, refused to counterattack. He had witnessed what his artillery could do to troops crossing open ground. He would not ask his men to suffer the same fate. Armistead died 2 days later in a Union field hospital, his wounds succumbing to infection. He was buried next to his uncle George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, the man who had inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a fitting resting place for a man whose final charge had become the most famous failed assault in American military history. On July 4, 1863, as Lee began his retreat back to Virginia, another Confederate stronghold fell 900 miles away. Vicksburg surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, splitting the Confederacy in two. Two decisive Union victories, 1 day apart. The South would fight for nearly 2 more years, but after July 3, 1863, after those 50 bloody minutes at Gettysburg, the Confederacy was never again strong enough to invade the North. Never again would Southern armies threaten Northern cities. The tide had turned. And it had turned in less than an hour in the time it takes to watch a television show on a hot Pennsylvania afternoon where 12,000 men marched into history and only 6,000 walked back. Pickett's charge remains a testament to both the courage of soldiers who followed orders into impossible odds and the horrific cost of such courage. It stands as a reminder that bravery alone cannot overcome superior position, overwhelming firepower, and tactical reality. And it marks the moment, the exact moment, when the Confederate dream of independence began its irreversible slide toward defeat, all in 50 minutes, all in one doomed, glorious, tragic charge across an open field in Pennsylvania.